All right. I'm going to share my screen. And there we go. All right, so today we're talking a little bit about the biological membranes. This structure is one of the, or arguably one of the most important structures on the cell, as it kind of serves as that barrier that sort of separates the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell. And so we're going to highlight, the goal of the talk today is to highlight the structure and makeup of this membrane a little bit. And we've talked about it a little bit already, but we'll talk a little bit more in detail about the structure of it, the major components that make up the membrane, and then we'll look at some of the activity that goes on at the membrane level. And I think we may have touched on it a little bit, but we're going to push through those things today. We're going to talk a little bit about how molecules are able to pass through the membrane by way of diffusion, osmosis, active and passive forms of transport. And by the end of today, we should have a greater appreciation for the role of this membrane serving sort of as that, again, that protective barrier, and then how it facilitates the movement or passage of molecules into and out of the cell. And so there are a few learning objectives here in terms of the cell membrane. We want to be able to evaluate the importance of membranes to the cell, describe the composition of membranes, summarize the function of membrane proteins. So we're going to talk a little bit about the proteins being one of the major components of the cell membrane. And so these proteins have various functions. There are different things going on at the cell membrane level in terms of signaling, communication, these receptor ligand activities, transport, channel proteins there that are helping things get across the membrane. We're going to describe the function of selectively permeable membranes. So we'll distinguish between this concept of being permeable or impermeable. The plasma membrane on biological cells are said to be selectively permeable, which means that it's going to be able to be permeated by certain substances, but not others. We'll contrast simple diffusion with facilitated diffusion. Osmosis will describe active transport. You've probably heard about penocytosis, phagocytosis. You've probably heard about those modes of transport, so forth. All right, so let's get started here. So biological membranes, we know that cells are tasked with the job of maintaining homeostasis, right? And an appropriate internal environment in order to carry out chemical processes that are required for life. So we know that tons and tons of reactions are taking place inside of the cell every day, exchange of fluids, so forth and so on, temperature regulation. All of these things are going on inside of the cell. And so the plasma membrane plays an important role in this concept of maintaining homeostasis, right? So make a note of this. Every single cell type has a plasma membrane, right? I know you saw the previous chapter, we talked about some things that were present on the animal cell. Some things are present in the plant cell. Some things are present in eukaryotic cells. They're not present in prokaryotic cells. Well, in this particular conversation, the plasma membrane, every cell will have a plasma membrane, all right? And the most important role of this plasma membrane is that it separates the internal cell from the external environment, right? And so first and foremost, one of the most important jobs that it does is that it regulates the passage of materials into and out of the cell. And so again, if you think about the cell, you know, sort of as a living entity, right? Like your body, you regulate what goes into your body, right? Because you know that if things go in your body that shouldn't be there, can cause problems. And so the plasma membrane sort of function as that first layer or barrier of protection, synonymous to our skin, right? Our skin is our first layer of protection. It's going to regulate the passage of materials into and out of the cell. We want certain things to come into the cell, nutrients, water, gases, oxygen, so forth. And we also want things to be able to exit the cell, okay? Waste products and so forth. And so the plasma membrane plays an important role in to facilitate those processes. So structurally, the biological membrane or the plasma membrane is made of a complex structure of lipids and proteins, right? So these are two of those four biological molecules that we talked about. Talked about carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So these lipids and proteins are very important components of the cell membrane. Okay. And so these biological membranes, let's write some of these jobs down. They have some very important jobs or functions. Most importantly, plasma membranes regulate the passage of materials into and out of the cell. Okay, we're clear that every single cell has a plasma membrane. Okay, not to confuse those with additional structures like the cell wall or the capsid that you may find on bacteria, but all cells are going to have a plasma membrane or a biological membrane. So vital functions: regulating the passage of materials, serving as a surface for chemical reactions to take place, serving as a means for cell-cell adherence, right? We know that tissues are formed through aggregates of cells interacting together. And so at the plasma membrane level, there's mechanisms for cells to adhere to one another, okay? The cell membrane also serves as a means for signal transduction, okay? Transmitting signals between the environment and the inside of the cell. Okay, so these are some important functions of the plasma membrane. Structurally, the plasma membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. All right, we talked about this a little bit already, but we know that the cell membrane consists of a fluid bilayer of phospholipids. So this isn't a static structure, sort of a dynamic fluid structure made up of these phospholipid molecules. All right. So we've already described these two layers of lipids, okay, that kind of form this like continuous sheet around the cell. These phospholipids have characteristics of being an amphipathic molecule. I think you have this in your notes already. The amphipathic molecule is going to be one that has both a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic component. Our heads of the phospholipid are hydrophilic. The tails are hydrophobic. Make sure you have that. Okay. This is a phospholipid right here. Okay. We've got this red head region and we got these yellow hydrophobic tail regions. Okay. This is a phospholipid bilayer. That bilayer indicates that we have two sheets of phospholipids interacting together. Okay. This phospholipid bilayer will form a continuous sheet or barrier around the cell. All right. With the heads pointing to the aqueous environment, this water out here in the external environment, as well as inside of the cell. We know that's also water. All right. Also on the cell membrane, you will find membrane proteins. All right. So we've got lipids, mostly the phospholipid, and then we've got proteins. All right, so these membrane proteins are going to be interacting with the membrane in various capacities. Okay, these membrane proteins are very important in different cellular activities that take place, you know, at the cell level, as well as transporting molecules into the cell. Okay, so some important jobs of our membrane proteins are to transport material, transmit information, and connect cells to other cells. Okay, I saw a hand raised.
Yes, I was asking, the hydrophilic, the
Yes.
head is hydrophilic, correct?
Yes, ma'am. Hydrophilic head.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. And so if you look at this image right here, this is an illustration of a biological membrane, and we've got various proteins present in this membrane. And these membranes have different jobs, okay? They're associated with the membrane in different ways. We have integral proteins here that are embedded or firmly, they're gonna be firmly embedded throughout the width of the membrane. All right, well, you have peripheral proteins here that are associated with the inner or outer layer of the membrane. All right. All right, so if we wanted to classify some types of membrane proteins in terms of how tightly they are associated with that lipid bilayer, we can distinguish between integral and peripheral membrane proteins. as I was just describing, these integral proteins, as that name suggests, are going to be very integral to the structure of this phospholipid bilayer. And any attempt to remove it, to remove this protein here, because you can see it sort of spans the width of this protein from internal all the way to the external environment. Any attempt to remove it would basically disrupt the cell and or compromise the integrity of this membrane. Basically, you would kill the cell. Okay. So by definition, we're going to say that integral membrane proteins are firmly bound to the membrane. They extend both in and out of the cell. Releasing or removing this integral protein would require disrupting that bilayer. We sometimes refer to them as transmembrane proteins. As we can see that it sort of spans the whole entire width of that phospholipid bilayer. Okay, you can contrast that with peripheral proteins, right? In this illustration that I have here, peripheral proteins here is associated with the inner surface of that membrane. Okay, peripheral proteins are not going to be firmly embedded in that lipid bilayer, but they're going to be located on either the inner or outer surfaces of the membrane. So other jobs of the membrane proteins, again, we talked about anchoring, transporting molecules, enzymatic activity. Okay, so there's signaling, there's all types of reactions that's going on at the membrane level. We know that enzymes are a type of protein that catalyze reactions. Okay, so there's enzymatic activity that may go on the cell surface. Okay, transport molecules across the membrane. We talked a little bit previously about the fact that not all substances can easily permeate or move through that membrane. Okay, we talked about the small nonpolar substances such as gases, oxygen, and so forth can easily permeate that membrane. But when we consider the larger, more complex molecules, such as glucose and other ions, they're going to require assistance. Okay, in order to move across the protein, across the membrane. And so these proteins can function as channels, okay, or transporters to get these larger, more complex molecules across the cell, okay? And then we also have integrins, which are proteins that assist in anchoring the cell to other substrates in the cell, okay? So there's several different functions of membrane proteins depending on what's going on or what needs to happen. So we've got transport proteins, enzymes, proteins that play a role in signal transduction, cell-cell recognition, interjoining or anchoring, also anchoring or attaching to the extracellular matrix. Do I hear a question? If not, please mute your mics for me. All right, so checkpoint question here. Write this down in your notes. This is an open-ended question that you should be able to answer at this point. What roles do membrane proteins play in cell interactions? There are several answers that you can have for this. Okay, there are a number of different roles that membrane proteins play in cell interactions. Okay, including transport, signaling, adhesion, and the like. Okay, so you should be able to answer this question in your notes without too much problems. So again, I mentioned already that biological membranes are sort of fluid dynamic structures that are considered to be closed. All right, there's a separation, a clear separation between the inside of the cell and the outside of the cell. Okay, the main function of that biological membrane as a closed system is that it's going to regulate what's going to be able to enter and leave the cell. Okay. We've talked a little bit already about that bilayer structure where we've got those polar heads and those non-polar hydrophobic tails, okay, creating that phospholipid bilayer. All right. We know that in that phospholipid bilayer, there are proteins embedded. Okay, we've got integral proteins and we've got peripheral proteins. All right. You should definitely, if I showed you images or diagrams, you should be able to distinguish between what an integral protein looks like or where it's located, and an integral protein, which is going to span the width of the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, it's going to be firmly embedded, and you should be able to visualize it. If you try to remove or detach this integral protein, you're going to disrupt the integrity of that plasma membrane. Okay. We already talked about these common features of biological membranes. We know that the major components, you should have this in your notes, are that they're mostly made up of lipids and protein, particularly the phospholipid. And then they're arranged in sort of this sheet-like layer, okay, that we'll call that phospholipid bilayer. Now, I keep mentioning that the cell membrane regulates what's coming in and what's coming out. We refer to that as permeability, okay? The cell's ability to regulate chemical traffic across the plasma membrane is determined by the composition of that cell membrane, that phospholipid bilayer, okay? So a cell that allows substances to pass, if a substance is going to be able to easily pass through this biological membrane, we're going to say that the cell membrane is permeable to that substance. If the cell membrane does not allow the substance to pass through readily, we're going to say that it's impermeable, right? The plasma membrane is not completely permeable or impermeable. It is semi-permeable, okay? In your text, you may see the term semi-permeable, which basically means that it allows for some substances to pass, but not all. Okay. So we're clear that our plasma membrane in biological systems are highly selective, is a highly selective permeability barrier. Okay, so things that are most permeable, as I mentioned before, are going to be small hydrophobic molecules such as gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide, that can cross the membrane pretty rapidly, easily, without too much assistance. Water molecules are an exception in terms of being nonpolar. We know that water molecules are polar, but they are small enough to pass through the membrane readily. Things that are relatively impermeable are going to be larger charged ions, large polar molecules, glucose, amino acids. Again, water is an exception as a polar molecule that can pass easily. Okay. I'm pushing through this kind of quickly because I think we've talked about a lot of this already. Checkpoint questions. What types of molecules pass easily through the plasma membrane? All right. Transport proteins, right? These transport proteins are found in all biological membranes, right? Biological membranes, we said, are closed systems. So there's got to be ways for things to get into and out of the cell. So transport proteins are going to function by doing what? They're going to move needed molecules through membranes. Okay, we need certain ions, amino acids, sugars, other molecules, macromolecules. We need them into the cell. And so transport proteins are going to aid in that process, okay? Two main types of transport proteins are going to be carrier proteins and channel proteins, okay? Each of these are going to carry substances or function as transporters to get substances into the cell. Carrier protein, as the name suggests, defined as proteins that transport. They bind to the molecule and transport it across the membrane. okay? Carrier proteins. These are going to be transporters that bind to the molecule, all right? Channel proteins. Channel proteins function by forming tunnels or openings, okay, that function as a gate. These channel proteins are going to open and close, all right? These are pores, all right? They function sort of as gates or channels in order to allow for substances to cross into the cell. Okay. So you should be able to identify and distinguish between two types of transport proteins. We've got carrier proteins and channel proteins, all right? Carrier proteins function as transporters that are going to bind to the molecule and transport it across that membrane. Channel proteins are going to form tunnels or openings. You've heard of a channel. Channels are something that open, all right? So channel proteins function by regulating the passage of substances through opening and closing of a gate, right, in response to stimuli. So the need for a particular ion would cause a response, all right, for these channels to open and allow for this substance to enter the cell. All right, these are just images or illustrations of what transport proteins can look like, right? They can facilitate channel mediated diffusion or carrier mediated diffusion, where the substance in this case would bind to this protein and be transported across, right? Channel proteins here are going to create this sort of opening, if you will, to allow for the passage of this substance across the cell. Those substances that can pass easily, like the gases and so forth, they're going to be able to pass across this membrane easily unassisted by way of simple diffusion. It's going to diffuse across in between those lipids, right? So we said that this bilayer, this plasma membrane, is a sort of fluid bilayer, fluid mosaic model that allows for the passage of certain nonpolar small molecules to pass easily. So checkpoint question here. You want to answer this later in your notes. What are two main types of transport protein and what are their functions? All right, diffusion. All right, so I mentioned simple diffusion just a moment ago. Diffusion is a process in which substances pass into or out of the cell. This is a process that's based on random motion, right? So there's no input of energy. There's no assistance for this to happen. It's going to happen. Jot this down in your notes that diffusion is a form of passive transport, which means that it does not require energy. All right, this is going to be in contrast to active transport that does require an input of energy. So many ions and small molecules are going to be able to move through biological membranes by way of diffusion. All right. So an example of diffusion in your real life would be if you sprayed some perfume, right, in one area of the room. Eventually, everyone in the room will be able to smell your perfume because those small fragrance molecules will eventually diffuse across the room, okay, without any assistance. You don't have to do anything, but those molecules will move. And by definition, diffusion is the movement of molecules across the membrane from an area of higher concentration to low concentration. You need to understand this definition. Jot it down. Diffusion is the movement of molecules across the membrane from an area of higher concentration to lower concentration with an attempt to basically reach equilibrium. Okay. So diffusion. This is an illustration of what's happening during diffusion. Particles net movement from an area of high concentration to lower concentration. So when you first spray that perfume, it's going to be concentrated in one area, but eventually those molecules are going to move or spread out across the air and diffuse towards an area where it's less concentrated. Okay. And in order to reach sort of this equilibrium. And so you can see here in this illustration, these molecules begin to sort of diffuse and disperse out in this random motion, okay? So we said the diffusion is an example of passive transport. All right, we're clear that passive transport does not require an input of energy. So there's two types of passive transport. So we've got simple diffusion, where those small uncharged molecules can move directly through the membrane, right? And then we have facilitated diffusion, where transport proteins make the membrane permeable to particular solutes, right? So passive transport, simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion. Facilitated diffusion, again, is through the assistance of these membrane proteins that are going to be there, the carrier proteins and transport proteins. And then we've got diffusion where these molecules can randomly move through that lipid bilayer without any assistance. These are forms of passive transport. Another type of diffusion is osmosis. All right, but osmosis refers specifically to the diffusion of water across a selectively permeable membrane from an area of low concentration to high concentration. So we're saying that water is going to be able to move freely through a semi-permeable barrier. Water can move freely. Okay. And so again, we're here with an effort or with a goal of trying to reach equilibrium. Okay. Active transport, movement of molecules from areas of low concentration to high concentration. Active transport does require energy. Write that down. Active transport requires energy. When I think about active transport, I try to think about like going uphill. Like if you were trying to climb a hill, walk a hill, run up a hill, you're gonna require or utilize energy in order to get that done. You won't move up that hill as easily if you were walking on a flat plane. Okay. And so active transport is going to look a little bit different in terms of how these molecules can permeate the membrane. It's going to require energy in the form of ATP. Okay, so if you were comparing or contrasting or distinguishing between forms of passive transport and active transport, one of the variables here is that we're definitely going to need ATP, right? Okay. Examples of active transport: endocytosis, exocytosis. Write these terms down. You've certainly heard of them before. All right. Endocytosis, where materials are taken into the cell. Okay, it's kind of like cell eating. All right. Exocytosis, materials are ejected from the cell. So waste products, broken down products, degraded products are going to be released or ejected from the cell by way of exocytosis. Okay. So you don't have to respond to those questions today. So we're gonna stop here, right? So we have certainly completed the